Welcome to this Institute for Government live event on how COVID-19 has changed the way government works. And this is also the event where we're launching Whitehall Monitor 2022. That's the latest edition of our annual report on the size, shape and performance of government. I'm Alex Thomas. I'm a Programme Director at the IFG and part of the team across the whole Institute that worked on the report. When we were putting it together, we were thinking particularly about what the data in the report told us about how decisions were made in responding to COVID and its new variants over the last year or so. And we were thinking about how COVID, following Brexit, significantly increased the size of the government and particularly the civil service. What does that tell us about resilience and capacity in the British state? And today, we're at a sobering moment as the Prime Minister is due to address Parliament over the deepening crisis in Ukraine. How good is the national British government at discharging its responsibilities for foreign security policy, but also healthcare, public services, and all while, as we've seen in the last few months, a political scandal rocks the Prime Minister? So to help us cover all of that, send in your questions. Use the button on your screens. If you can, say who you are and where you're from, and uprate the questions that you'd like to see answered. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the most popular ones and try and ask them to the panel. And follow us on Twitter at IFG Events and with the hashtag IFGWM22. So we've got a fantastic panel to help us cover these questions and others. Dame Glenys Stacey is the chair of the new Office for Environmental Protection and someone who really knows her way around government. She's also been chief regulator at Ofqual twice, chief inspector of probation and head of the Animal Health Agency, amongst many other things across government. William Wragg is the Member of Parliament for Hazel Grove and is chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which scrutinises the Cabinet Office and the work of government reform. So for our purposes today, he is the perfect MP to have on the panel. Charlotte Pickles is director of the think tank Reform, has been a special advisor and has worked at the Centre for Social Justice, as well as elsewhere in the public and private sector. And Matthew Holehouse is a correspondent on British politics at The Economist, and I hope you won't mind me saying, is a particularly keen watcher of developments for good and ill in Whitehall and Westminster. But before we hear from them, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Rhys Klein, who was also part of that team working on Whitehall Monitor this year, and he's just for a few minutes going to take us through some of the headlines from the report. Rhys.
Thanks, Alex. This year's report explores two principal questions about the performance of central government. Firstly, what was the impact of COVID on government last year? How did it affect government size, makeup and the work that it does? And secondly, what does this mean for how the government is set up to achieve its plans in 2022? We've analysed these questions through the lenses of the civil service, the work of ministers, government spending, comms and transparency, digital and arm's length bodies. So I'm going to just, as Alex said, whip through a few of our key findings to begin the discussion. So we see the impact of COVID on government, firstly, in the accelerated growth of the civil service. There were more than 470,000 officials by September last year, a 10% increase on the year before. Unsurprisingly, as this chart shows, the biggest proportional growth fell by some distance on the Department of Health and Social Care, which nearly doubled in the year up to September, topping out at more than 4,000 officials. But the biggest growth in absolute numbers came in the much larger Department of Work and Pensions. And conversely, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office was the only department to shrink in the year up to September 2021, reducing by 7% in that time. As you can see by this chart, what that means for the civil service is that it has grown by about 88,000 people, or 23%, since the EU referendum in 2016, bringing it back to the size it was in 2010, prior to the staffing cuts made by the coalition government. The government has announced plans to relocate nearly 15,000 civil service roles around the UK by the middle of this decade. As you can see from the map on screen, and most of these moves were reported recently in the Levelling Up white paper. This is a promising step towards the government's target of moving 22,000 civil service roles outside of London by the end of the decade. But the relocation agenda will be made more difficult by the fact that the civil service grew disproportionately in London last year. The number of officials working in the capital grew by 11%, the highest of any region in the UK. The growth of the civil service in London partly reflects the increase of the number of officials working on policy, which increased by about 17% in the year up to March 2021. The Department of Health and Social Care alone had around 1,000 more policy officials than it did at the start of the pandemic, with a similar increase seen at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. This trend also began in 2016, as you can see from the chart on screen, following the referendum, since when the policy profession has grown by nearly 12,000 staff, an increase of around 71%. This is understandable given the policy demands of Brexit, COVID and other issues like net zero, but the government has recently committed to reducing the civil service headcount to pre-COVID levels while protecting some frontline roles and prioritising other skills, which does suggest that this growth of policy officials might need to be stemmed if that target is going to be met. For the second fiscal year in a row, the government spending has remained very high at over £1 trillion this year, but both spending and the deficit will be lower than they were than last year's peak. And this is also mirrored by the scale of coronavirus-related support to businesses, households and public services, shown on screen here, which, while remaining high at £91 billion, will fall by about half compared to last year's peak. Compared to last year's support, a higher proportion of the spending this year has gone directly to public services, with a sharper fall in support for households directly as schemes like furlough drew to a close. And of that public service spend, a greater proportion is itself being more narrowly targeted at the Department of Health and Social Care. Our analysis shows that just as the pandemic changed how government overall works, it has also changed how individual ministers spend their time. The number of speeches, for example, given by the Health Secretary has increased significantly over the last 2 years, for instance, through Downing Street press conferences, which are included in this chart here. However, in 2021, the COP26 President, Alok Sharma, gave more speeches than any other minister, including the PM, demonstrating the importance of the COP26 conference to government. Understandably, the demand for information from the government has also grown over the course of the pandemic. We can see that in the number of parliamentary questions fielded by departments, which is higher than at any other point in the last decade, in the last session, and that the Department of Health and Social Care received over 13,000 written questions, more than double that of any other department. But at the same time, the government continued a long-running trend of worsening transparency, which predates COVID-19. We can see that, for instance, in the chart on screen, which shows the proportion of FOI requests partially or fully withheld, which has been steadily increasing since the Freedom of Information Act came into effect in 2005. Fewer than half of FOI requests resulted in information being fully released in the first half of last year. So to the second question of our report, what this means for how government is set up to achieve its plans. Well, we can look at 2021 as something of a bridging year for government. What time and attention ministers and officials could apply beyond crisis management was largely spent making and setting out plans. We had the net zero strategy, white papers on health and social care reform, the declaration on government reform, plans for digital, a multi-year spending review, and then more recently at the start of this year, the much awaited Levelling Up white paper. But we are halfway through the Parliament. The government has understandably lost time to the pandemic and has been distracted by controversies over standards in public life. And ministers are therefore short on time to make sure their priorities are delivered before the next election. This demands a shift in 2022 from policy making to implementation. And our analysis in the report of the management of the government machine suggests there are two factors to look out for that will affect the government's delivery capability. Firstly, how effectively will departments spend the extra money allocated to them in the spending review? As you can see from our analysis on screen, the budget allocations were similarly generous in October's review as they were in the 2004 and 2007 spending reviews under New Labour, with a more than 3% average increase to day-to-day spending. But they're also front-loaded, with most of those increases coming in the next financial year, which makes the question of effective administration all the more important. And these increases also come after a decade of cuts. All but 4 departments are expected to have lower budgets in real terms in 2025 than they did in 2010. And administrative budgets will also be constrained, with an annual increase of 1% compared to the 3% in day-to-day spending. This creates a risk that departments might not be able to administer their increased budgets as effectively as they might want to. Secondly, how will ministers and senior officials meet the target for civil service headcount reductions to pre-COVID levels by the end of the review period? This will entail a reduction of anywhere between 25 and 55,000 roles, depending on how the government chooses to protect frontline roles. And it means that ministers and senior officials face difficult decisions about how they're going to start heading towards meeting that target while not undermining the government's delivery capability. Finally, this chart comes from a paper the Institute published just before Christmas, for which colleagues analysed progress made against the 287 commitments included in the 2019 Conservative Manifesto. We found that the government is on track to complete 55% of these commitments, and it is off track in key areas such as hiring healthcare workers, agreeing free trade deals, and enacting its levelling up ambitions. So, to improve the capability of central government to balance its responsibilities towards long-term priorities and towards crisis management, government reform will be crucial in 2022. The Declaration on Government Reform published last year was a real signal of intent, and progress has been made since then. But the government is behind schedule on achieving the 30 actions included in the declaration, which it will need to do in 2022 and then go further, setting out longer term plans for some of the more complex areas of reform. By ensuring that momentum is kept up on this agenda, the PM has the opportunity to improve the government's overall ability to deliver for citizens. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Rhys. 10-minute canter through government in 2022. And before I go to the panel, just another plug for questions. They're coming in thick and fast already, but do send them in, please. So I'll open with reflecting on that, picking up some of the themes as we go through. I'll open with Matthew. I mean, obviously, the pandemic changed the way government works. And it's become a bit of a truism about sort of dropping the things that have gone wrong and bottling the things that worked well. It is obviously also right to point out the deficiencies in the government's response. But what do you think the government did better during the pandemic? And how do you think, whether it's on data or public services or communications, how do you think they can translate those successes into business as whatever normal is now?
I mean, it's been an extraordinary experiment in many ways. In that there are sort of three forces bearing down on the British government. One was during the pandemic that obviously they had to do new things, and many of the new things that it was required to do were things that had not even been conceived of in drills for previous pandemic exercises. Things like home education, law enforcement, shielding. At the same time, the state was having to operate on a new set of assumptions and principles. So the normal sort of rules of the road of government business around what is acceptable value for money, acceptable risk of projects failing, around the way in which you would use data, all had to be recalibrated towards this shift from sort of day-to-day work to urgency. And at the same time, create new sets of assumptions and new principles, so that it wasn't a complete sort of free fall, as it were. And at the same time, the third factor is that you have this a political leadership at the time that was really driving a culture of agility and of improvisation, of perhaps a lower regard for the constraints that bear down on civil service activity. Normally, a real sort of move fast and break things culture, sort of represented by Dominic Cummings. So these things coming together, as much as there was a recipe for real problems and failures, which have been well covered around Ofqual and Public Health England. It was also a real sort of cauldron of innovation, which does speak to the, the underlying capacity of the civil service to respond to this. And it is quite a long list. If you look at cabinet level to start with, we saw the development of the EXO and XS committees. This is which took place under Brexit. This is the development of much smaller committees to focus on the development of Brexit strategy and then the delivery of Brexit. That was replicated in COVID, effectively building on supplanting the system of cabinet committees which have been in place for 100 years before then. Very sort of daily, high tempo, very focused on taking and executing decisions, which we know the cabinet secretary said that he'd like to see replicated throughout government business in future. Your report talks very well about the development of digital programs which were rolled out at speed in the pandemic. The vaccine booking system, the universal credit proved itself capable of handling a much higher demand, and really quite an extraordinary effort of building the capacity to share data between government departments, between local government, which is something that one would hope can be built on and retained in future. A third big area, which I'm slightly contrarian on this, is devolution. We've seen a lot of focus on the conflict at the top between the devolved governments and Whitehall over funding, over lockdown policies, over differentiated approach to COVID. Often, this has become sort of a proxy battle for the debate over the union versus independence. Actually, I think under the hood, as it were, there were many cases of the devolved governments and central government working quite successfully together on developing response, which made sense in a UK context, whilst being differentiated in accordance with the desires of the devolved governments, and in some ways reflecting the wishes of relevant populations. And in many senses, actually overcoming what we know to be the structural weaknesses of devolution and the way in which powers are divided. So we know the existing structures through the JMC were effectively sidelined and replaced with much more sort of informal, ad hoc, collaborative working. There was very, very effective working between the CMOs and the chief scientific advisors of the devolved governments and those of the UK government working through SAGE. And we saw the capacity actually of the UK government to operate in the devolved domains in a centralized way, a way that made sense. So the deployment of the British Army, the centralization of PPE and vaccine procurement. So it does show actually that for all the structural design flaws that were exposed in devolution in a crisis like this, they can actually be overcome, if the political will is there. A third area, which is a fourth area rather, is worth noting, is the government's statistical capacity. I think the Office for National Statistics had a very, very good pandemic. There was a very large increase in publications. They had to develop new methods to measure and gather data because of the inability to physically go into shops or interview people, and they produced some rather powerful new publications. So the COVID infection survey and the business insights and conditions survey, which is effectively a fortnightly evolving survey of what's happening in businesses, is something that I think they'll expect to retain. Now, a fifth area, which perhaps isn't a positive development, but it's certainly a striking one, is actually the way in which government communicates. The pandemic coincided with a shift to a much more sort of politicized Downing Street communications operation, a much more sort of aggressive and slightly partisan. You can make a debate about the virtues of that, but at the same time, the need for public cooperation to bind in a whole of society effort, and the need to simply publicize the government's message resulted in sort of innovations. We've seen the much higher tempo of press conferences from the Prime Minister and senior ministers, the introduction of non-ministers at government press conferences, people like Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, which is was a relatively rare thing pre-COVID. And actually things like the COVID dashboard and the transparency around SAGE minutes were a relative innovation actually, and I think something that hopefully would an approach that would outlast the pandemic.
Thanks, Matthew. Really, really interesting. I agree with a lot of the themes you picked up there. I mean, it's worth just a note on devolution, and anyone who's looked at the report will see that we don't directly cover the devolved governments there. We focus on the kind of UK level government. But your points there about how they've worked together, I think I'd share your counterintuitive argument that actually some of this has happened more in lockstep than we might have picked up on from some of the commentary. The other point, very striking, you picked up on there was the nature of decision making and shifting decision making, the more directive decision making in a crisis to more kind of collaborative, persuasive decision making. And Charlotte, I want to come to you in that sort of Reese's presentation there picked out how the spending review last year was actually pretty generous and comparable to the new Labour years, which is a comparison that will probably annoy absolutely everybody. But on that kind of theme of the decisions shifting from command and control to tougher slogging, I mean, will those spending review investments be enough to deal with some of the almost incomprehensible backlogs in public services that we can expect over the next few years, and the cost of living crisis that those two things look like being aspects that will dominate politics and government for the next few years? Do you think the government's set up to be able to take those sorts of decisions and to drive them through?
I think I remember, I think it was only about halfway through the Chancellor's speech at the dispatch box when we got the spending review, and it was already being dubbed Brown Night. So so I'm not sure anyone would be terribly surprised that this is comparable to some of the Blair years. I think there are lots of unknowns, and sorry to not sound as decisive or as expert as perhaps I should do on the panel, but I think there's lots of question marks. Alex, you mentioned obviously the situation in Ukraine around actually how robust our economic forecasts are, and obviously a lot of the spending review in relation to fiscal rules and whether there's fiscal headroom, etc., is all dependent on what happens to economic growth or doesn't happen to economic growth. And then you have some, if I was sitting in Number 10 or in CCHQ or indeed anywhere on the kind of political side of government, I'd be deeply concerned right now about the backlogs that you mentioned and the cost of living crisis that you mentioned. And we've very much obsessed about and rightly I think, about the elective care backlog, and we will probably hit somewhere around 10+ million people sitting on that. But actually we've got backlogs across public services. Mental health backlogs are huge at the moment. We've got them in justice, we've got them in the Department of Work and Pensions in terms of benefit assessments, and although we don't quite think of education as a backlog, the catch-up challenge remains huge. And that's about people's lives in the same way that the cost of living crisis is about people's lives. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who thinks that the interventions that the Chancellor announced, what would it be, a few weeks back now, in terms of the energy crisis, are anywhere close to genuinely alleviating the pressures that are going to be on particularly low-income families. So if I was on the political side, I'd be thinking, I'm 2 years out of, or around 2 years out of a general election. I'm about to put taxes up to one of the highest sustained levels they've been at. My spending, my size of the state, is also one of the largest it's been certainly since the 80s in a non-recession period. You point all of this out in the Whitehall Monitor. What on earth am I going to do in that period? But I do think there are two other things to think about in terms of the public spending. Firstly, I think we've got ourselves into this odd rut where we create a baseline for spending as 2010, as though in some way that's a magical correct level of spending that must always go upwards. And I'm a bit confused by that, because I don't know what the evidence is that says that any particular level of spending is the right level of spending. And if you do it on that basis, you're just assuming that the size of the state is going to get bigger and bigger, our tax burden is going to get heavier and heavier, etc. So I think we slightly need to change the question and say, what is it we actually want from our public services, and what should we expect from our public services? And one of the things that the pandemic has done, I think, is to create a far greater expectation that the state will deal with anything and everything. And so I think there does need to be quite an honest conversation about whether that can remain to be the case. And, you know, we've done polling on this and people are not keen to increase their taxes. And there's not a lot of opportunity to spend more unless you're doing so. So I think firstly, we need to question whether.
It's like we have lost Charlotte there. We'll come back to in a moment. What I was thinking as she was talking there was how she'd really interestingly blended the high politics of the size of the state with the really geeky conversations that we have in the Institute for Government about baselines and where you set your baselines. And for a lot of Whitehall Monitor, we talked about 2010. But while we're trying to get Charlotte back, William, I'm going to come to you. And it does pick up on those points about the size of the state, because as we heard, civil service numbers have increased. They are back to where they were in 2010. Sorry, Charlotte. Rishi Sunak has announced plans to reduce staff numbers to pre-pandemic levels, and there was an interview with the new Minister for Government Efficiency, Jacob Rees-Mogg, over the weekend, suggesting that he wanted to go further than that. William, is the civil service too big? How, with your sort of committee chair hat on, would you go about working out which jobs to cut? And I'm going to throw in a popular comment from the questions, the Q&A section here as well, about location. Ron Marchant has said historically relocation of jobs from London has been mainly frontline customer service jobs and not policy. Given the growth in policy-based jobs in London, will this require that policy jobs move out as well? So, sort of, which is the civil service too big? If so, which jobs to cut? And do we need to be thinking more creatively about the location of jobs, particularly policy jobs? There's a few things in there, William.
I always think there's a danger in arbitrary targets, and really the question is, you know, what is the plan for the government to deliver its priorities, and how does it therefore put its cloth accordingly? I think your earlier graph showed this almost sort of the wave-like model. It undulated slightly in terms of overall numbers, and I suppose, you know, from my own simplistic mind, that's because we always have these debates and arguments as to the civil service has grown too big, therefore we must cut it. Then we have the same argument, but why are we reliant on these outsourced consultants? You know, that cost more money. We need to get rid of that, and those who we really need to train from within. And so you're going to always have this undulation from one to the other. Now, obviously, there's the sort of third party, DWP being a primary example in there, the health to you know, a certain extent as well. And I suppose, therefore, as the pandemic abates, the need for those numbers will reduce, and so you'll have a sort of reduction in that sense. But I think really we look at it from the wrong guess too often. We look at the raw numbers. Well, it really is the government's priority. And in terms of location, this is an interesting one. Also, when I saw an advertisement for a job in Darlington Treasury, and it said you do 100% work from home. What's the point of that then? You know, the idea that you locate civil servants to different parts of the country, these sort of slight apartments. The idea is sort of slightly pointed. You know, the idea, are you trying to recruit from those local areas and draw people in there, or are you relocating people from London? Or you know, and this, that, and the other. And of course, the interesting is about policy. The question with that will be: will the ministers work outside of London? I somehow doubt it. There'll be, stately progresses from time to time of opening these new hubs and centres. But really, the nature of policy such as it is will always have centralised aspects. There's no point pretending otherwise. So I'm curious to whether that works. I might be completely wrong on all of that, by the way, but no minutes and seeing them at close quarter, I don't think they're going to change their habits too much.
Thanks, William. It's definitely something we're keeping an eye on in terms of where the ministers locate themselves. And also, one very brief story, the civil service, from talking to a civil servant the other day, is getting itself in an awful tangle about flexible working, remote working and home working, and how the three are the same or different. So I think we can expect some more of these for the civil service cognoscenti anyway. But Glenys, I'm going to move on to you, and then Charlotte, I will come back to you as you're now, I can see, back online. Glenys, we talk quite often, and it's very easy to get sucked into the centre of government and the sort of top of the policy civil service and number 10 and all of that. But actually, there's a huge state out there that we can't forget. And you've had all sorts of jobs in the sort of curiously named arm's length bodies, ALBs, world. They've been put under pressure by the pandemic as well. They've had to change an awful lot. Media stress on public appointments. They've, you're the new head of a body that's been created to deal with new repatriated responsibilities from leaving the European Union. So, what do you think the government should be doing to reform the wider public sector, whether it's arm's length bodies or the sort of huge authorities that are so important to the running of the state? Glenys.
Thank you, and that's such an interesting question. So what I would say is that there's a sniff of public body reform about, isn't there? We had commitments last year to look at the way these bodies are governed and reviewed, but there's something upping the ante now, I feel, as we get over, hopefully, the worst of the COVID pandemic. But there are lessons from the past as you think about public body reform. So we know that past reform programmes have usually struggled to reduce staffing. I think you've commented on that yourself at IFG, and reducing funding as well. The number of bodies can reduce, but that's in part because some bodies emerge while others take on new functions, for example. So it's not quite so straightforward. And I think that does make you question, actually, ahead of any reform of public bodies, you need to be pretty clear about what the objectives of reform are, because it's not a panacea. It's not at all. Now, your report's making plain, I think, today that in your view, government needs to focus on, delivery, and that's music to my ears, because that's what I've always been involved in. Indeed, never have worked in Westminster, not yet anyway. So I think, the focus on delivery does lead to a pretty awkward question, and that is the civil service, is the public sector more widely actually able to support delivery sufficiently well, able to play the part it needs to play, not overplay it, but play its full part. And, to my mind, public bodies, their history, they really are, their remit and objectives are often set in statutes that almost always predate our exit from the European Union. And then for regulators, I have some experience of those, and their regulatory approaches are often set, and then they become concretized over time, actually, by their funding arrangements. So income from licensing, for example, can get you fixed into licensing as your predominant regulatory approach. And even the very reason they regulate, the regulatory objectives, they're often long-standing as well. And yet, society or social, economic, and the natural environment, they all change and work together over time, making it very difficult for these established bodies to change with it. Now, there are associated sort of skills and competence questions, really, as you focus on delivery. But I think that one of the most significant questions is actually about the configuration of the public sector, the configuration of departments. So are departments and their arm's length bodies configured sufficiently well to deliver what they now need to deliver? Is the organizational design or the operating model or each organization's objectives, facing the future or more likely actually facing the past? And I do think these questions really need to be asked and answered, even though I know it's not at all straightforward. And in some cases, you definitely need legislation to bring about the change that you might wish for. There's a couple of other things I'd be thinking about if I was in Rees-Mogg's shoes, for example. So COVID-19, as you point out so well in your report, it has accelerated digital transformation, not just here actually, but globally. You know, it's been fantastic in that one sense. But of course, we've now got much greater public expectations because of that, you know, but that's perhaps another story. But some of our public sector legacy IT infrastructure really struggles now to meet the expectations of the public or to support basic delivery actually sufficiently well. Now, as you say in your report, you know, new management has given fresh energy to digital reform, but within IT, there is now an industry-wide digital skills gap. And the impact for the UK government is actually exacerbated by the salaries and the day rates that can be offered. So digital data and technology vacancies have risen alarmingly of late. I'm told that we've now got over 4,000 at the start of this year, when it was half that last year. And I do really urge government to look at that, look it in the face and find ways to address it. There may well be opportunities, for example, in the levelling up agenda or from home working actually, but government does have to recognise that this pay gap for many departments and arms-length bodies is now becoming really unbridgeable. So whilst digital reform matters, so do our legacy systems actually. We have to keep tweaking them and we need good people to do that, and we're not getting it. And then just another point about the way we work. As we turn a focus on to delivery, thankfully, I do think it puts government on the spot a bit to think how better to join up, you know, strategy, policy and delivery in key areas, the environment, of course, being one that's dear to my heart. So the state of the environment is directly and indirectly affected by policies and actions of many departments. You know that, Alex, it's not just DEFRA. Similarly, many of DEFRA's objectives and policies depend on the active cooperation with other departments. You know, there's so many of these cross-cutting issues. So we know that moving to a circular economy to reduce waste requires alignment of industrial strategy with BEIS, and then improving air quality, so important, requires alignment on transport actually with DFT, and reducing the risk from hazards like the flooding we're seeing of late. It requires alignment on planning with the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Now, I know this is recognised. I know it's enormously difficult, actually, but now is the time for better arrangements for joining up, actually, difficult though it is. And that starts with overarching governance, actually. You know, we need a governance framework in order to make that happen. So I think I would actually urge government to prioritise delivery, as you are suggesting in your report. And if that is the case, then I do think there's a good argument for looking with a hard lens now, actually, at the configuration of departments and their arm's length bodies. We certainly need to prop up our digital skills. You know, it's not just about transformational reform, it's about the day job. And I would argue, above all, we just need to join up. But I know it's all enormously difficult. You know, of course I do. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Glenys. Some themes I hope in the remaining time we've got we'll come back to on digital skills and capability, on civil service pay, a perennial question, and on the sort of joining up of different government departments. And Charlotte, coming to you, picking up sort of from where you left off, but I will start with the questions from those who are watching, and it links to a bit to Glenys's point about joining up and different departments. So there's a question from, as well as to what you were saying about the size of the state and the finances. There's a question from Kerry about the implications of the tough financial position of the Communities Department, or the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, biggest department with the biggest financial losses since 2010, question mark, says Kerry. Given that local councils will be crucial in delivering levelling up and net zero, the local government sector has lost huge capacity headcount since 2010. This must be a delivery risk for the government. And it was notable that the levelling up white paper came out about, I think, 2 days after we published Whitehall Monitor. So it was very interesting sort of looking at the two in comparison. I mean, picking up where you left off, Charlotte, but also thinking about Kerry's question. What do you think?
Sorry, this is the first time I've had quite such a nightmare on an online event, so huge apologies. Yes, I think it's a great question, and where I was saying previously that I think we've sort of created this, if you like, dangerous straw man of saying that must be a baseline of spending, and anything that looks lower than it must therefore equal a problem. I think the one area you could say where it really has had a tremendously negative impact, and we do need more money, is in local government. And you're right. I think the Monitor says its budget since 2010 is about half what it was prior to that. And of course, part of the challenge there is actually because most of that is being taken up now by social care, because despite having 2 white papers, one on the funding and one on the delivery for social care, we are nowhere close to having a solution to the social care challenge, nowhere close. So part of that challenge for local government is actually we need central government to get a grip with what it really means to try and solve the social care crisis. But more than that, in terms of the Levelling Up white paper, as you mentioned, Alex, I mean, I think the best way to see the Levelling Up white paper is really a programme for government, or a sort of manifesto. You know, several people have said this. I don't really think it is a kind of programme for DLUC. You know, it is a programme for the entirety of government. And again, and picking up on Dame Glennis's comments, which I thought were spot on around this, we do get into dangerous territory when we only consider departmental budgets in isolation, because the majority of the money that's going into Levelling Up, and that Levelling Up white paper, I think I saw someone said it's in its entirety, because obviously it includes a lot of capital investment in infrastructure investment, is about 250 billion, I think, going through it. Now, clearly that isn't going through DLUC. So I think we need to be a bit careful, but I think the one area that I really would sort of sound a note of concern would be local government. And I also think it links to, as a very final brief comment, I know you want to get onto other questions, but I think it does link to the point about devolution and the relationship between the centre and the regions and local. And we haven't really touched on that. We've touched on the union, but actually I think there were some quite important observations of some of the dysfunction between the centre and local government that the pandemic exposed, and the fact that actually if you really want to level up, you're going to have to give much greater power, much greater resources to local government, because levelling up, as the government has framed it, is a place-based concept, and I don't think we're anywhere close to being where we need to be on that.
Thanks, Charlotte, really interesting. I'm going to move on. There are quite a few questions about sort of transparency and openness, and I might, William, from your sort of committee chair perspective, and then Matthew as a journalist. This question from Anonymous that he or she says is rhetorical, but has COVID-19 aided or hindered government openness, honesty, and integrity? And then an anonymous person says, which administration has been the most transparent? Does your comment about reducing transparency reflect the political hue of the administration? I'm not sure we need to get into the politics, William, because I'm interested in what you're going to say. But in terms of your perspective as a committee chair, how open the government has been. I mean, Matthew said earlier there've been some of the data, and the Office of National Statistics and so on has been extremely open. Whereas in other areas, as our report shows, FOI responses and so on, the picture's got less transparent. So what's your perspective, William?
It was an hour to have transparency questions from anonymous questioners, but leave that
yes.
to one side. Yes, it's a mixed picture. You know, the OS, as you alluded to, has had a quote pandemic, and there's you know, massive raft of data can be you know, drilled down upon. But of course we have things that catch the interest of my committee. It ranges from, you know, the MI, Clearhouse, some of the things information the last information said about that. So, and overall, it's hard to deny that there is an impression of secrecy, and that's sort of that's putting it as delicate and politically as I might. And it's almost too easy to some, you know, the disinfectants of sunlight. My colleague Dol Price likes a committee is shone upon more of it. I think if this was a question that was, you know, a wider proprietary ethics issue, I think when I become the chair of the committee a couple of years ago, I've seen very much a sort of hobby horse for sort of halo polishers. And it's become a much more mainstream concern. I think that where we're at, regardless of people's different opinions on Partygate and other matters, where we're at, it gives us a direct consequence to what happened to with my former colleague Omicron and the vote that occurred on that. And I think quite suddenly it's gained the prominent attention of more people in my committee. And I think that in terms of it sort of added to that sense of lack of openness, a slight secrecy. And I don't think that is a particularly good look to have.
Thanks, William. It may just be me, but there was a slight glitch on your sound there. I don't know. I hope people could hear that. I think we got most of what you were saying. Certainly the core of it. I mean, Matthew, picking up on that, and again, this is not the place to get into the ins and outs of Partygate and so on. But there are the questions about the sort of openness and integrity of the government and how reliable its the information it provides are. Given the sorts of things about government effectiveness that we're talking about here, how do you think that the two intersect?
Yes, I mean, just picking up your findings on FOI, I mean, I think, and I know William's committee is looking at this. I mean, the government basically needs to make a choice about whether it wants to have an FOI regime or not, and legislate accordingly. Because at the moment, what you've got is a system which was sort of created. The idea of creating a US-style system where if you've ever filed an FOI request in the United States, you can get pretty much whatever you want. You get huge deposits of data. You have a legal framework which is intended to do that, meeting a culture that simply doesn't want to provide that sort of information. Coupled with the fact that it is, I can understand the civil services frustration, where it becomes a sort of almost a question and answer system for any member of the public to ask, whatever they fancy, actually produces a sort of a bit of a log jam. So there does need to be some candor and a rethink about actually what does the government want this system to achieve? What does Parliament want this system to achieve, and create a system that does that? Because at the moment we have a bit of a pantomime where you put in a request and it gets denied, and sort of it doesn't really satisfy anybody. The broader question around government ethics, I think this does risk becoming it is becoming a serious political problem for the government, and I think you can trace that if you were on the ground in Cheshire, Amersham, or in North Shropshire. Actually, this question of sleaze and propriety is starting to really inflict some damage. What you have is a culture of sort of laxness of the sort which William has talked about, a culture in which the sort of administrative rules of government were held in low regard. People like Cummings thought they were an inhibition on effective government. You can have to debate about whether that's the case. Coupled with the fact that the pandemic did almost, as a crisis situation, necessitate a much higher degree of waste and risk than would be in the case of normal operations. Now, that required a new appeal to the benefit of the doubt to say to the public, we know the HMRC knew, for example, that the business loan scheme would have a waste of somewhere between 5 and 10%. It came out about 8%. So this waste is almost baked into the systems in the crisis because of the speed with which they have to respond. The government's problem is that it cannot appeal to moral authority and cannot ask for the benefit of the doubt because of the culture with which it went into the crisis, and so you're starting to see a fusing of those two things, which are really, I think, is becoming very, very dangerous for them.
Really interesting there. Glynis, I'm going to ask you a brilliant IFG event question, which is from Anonymous again. But the pandemic demonstrated a clear demand for a diverse range of specialists. Is the time of the Whitehall generalist over? What do you think, Glynis?
Thank you. Just before I answer that, can I say something about the transparency discussion? Because it was just so interesting. Can I? So I think there is a risk that we are judging government by sort of peacetime standards, when the government would argue, we were at war with a pandemic. And I think we just need to be a bit careful about that. And I would also say that in my view, transparency is important, but there's a mistake to think it means trust. It isn't. If you're not transparent, you lose trust. But if you are transparent, you're not necessarily trusted. So I do think we need to understand what we expect from transparency, really. And I would say that arm's length bodies, or some of them, Ofqual being one that I'm familiar with, have learnt the hard way, what transparency really means. So it isn't just about FOI. These are very crude measures that we're talking about here. Actually, it is being much more honest and open about how you make decisions, how and why you prioritise, how these organisations work. And it is about actively listening to people that you may not agree with. That's what actually builds trust ultimately. If you listen to their ideas, for example, and try and work them up into something that the best it can be, and maybe that person then realise actually it's not going to work, is it? But you know what I mean? It's as much about a much broader way of working than simply publishing your minutes of a board meeting. But I'll stop there.
No, it's really interesting, because I wanted to before we come back to the generalist question, I think we completely acknowledge the crudeness of some of these measures.
Okay.
And that's almost, it points to the sort of flip side of, or the companion to transparency, which is accountability. And Glenys,
Yeah.
I'd love to get your thoughts on whether it's from an arm's length body perspective or anything else, whether the actual problem we're trying to grapple with here is accountability rather than transparency.
It might well be. So the measures that you're using for transparency, I've said they're crude, and they're proxy measures, aren't they? At best, that's it. That's terrible. On accountability, I think you're right. And I suspect we've got quite a big problem, actually, that's been quietly brewing for a number of years. That accountability has become much less explicit, much more diffuse as well. And, when you start trying to identify, for example, let's say, from my perspective, where are the policies relating to improving biodiversity in the environment and who is accountable and responsible, it's virtually impossible to map it, I have found, and I'm not the only one. So there is a big issue. But my point, I think, is it's not just about, 4 or 5 prime secretaries of state and number 10. It's a much bigger issue for public service, actually. And you get to the point where it matters when you actually want to hold people to account, for delivery, which is where we're getting to, isn't it? On the generalists versus specialists, I think it's hugely interesting. I've always rather taken the view that people like to hear from specialists when we're in a crisis, that they believe them, they trust them. It is quite interesting. I remember years ago when I was chief executive of what was then Animal Health, and you'll know we were dealing with a good number of, let's say, outbreaks of avian influenza, not that long ago. It was new to us all. We didn't want to hear from politicians, did we? In the public, we wanted to hear from the chief vet, and our deputy chief vet. People trust our experts, and actually, I think in times of COVID, they really have stood up. I mean, not just in terms of the public-facing work they've done, but in the work that's been done to develop vaccines, for example, the work that's been done to understand COVID and be able to treat patients well. We have seen experts really be valued, I think, in the last year or two, and they do tend to get valued in a crisis. But I've always taken the view in an arm's length body that you need a sufficient number of them and that the public trusts them rather than the CEO. So I think that's just my experience has told me that. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenys. Charlotte, you want to come in on the accountability points, I think, or anything else from Glenys?
Yes, a mixture of the accountability, transparency, and this idea of generalists and specialists. And I think they're one of my observations of the pandemic period, and one of the things that we've written about, and I think you have as well, was that there wasn't a great deal of articulation of the trade-offs involved. And I think we became over-dependent actually on COVID experts in infectious diseases, in the kind of case numbers and transmissions. And we almost ignored, certainly in the first phase, all of the knock-on impacts that solely focusing on that one area of specialism meant that you weren't picking up. So yes, we had the Treasury doing its economic stuff, and that was great, but actually we ignored the mental health impacts. We basically turned off business as usual for healthcare other than COVID. We clearly made a complete hash of the education process. So I think there's something about actually understanding the role of experts, but actually needing to understand that in the context of a broader set of decision making, which only elected politicians should be able to do. And that is not a role for experts to be making decisions on behalf of the nation about things. They should be feeding into it. And I think there's a risk of a kind of almost dereliction of duty on behalf of politicians if they just pass on those decisions. And just as a very final comment, I totally agree again on with Dan Glennis, because I don't think transparency does equal trust. I do think competency can equal trust, and actually there's quite a lot of evidence on that. And I think we've got this terrible situation where there's been lots of question marks, let's put it delicately, about competency, which has then combined with this lack of transparency, or at least a sense of opaqueness and of favoritism and the whiff of scandal as well as actual scandal. And that together has undermined trust. But I think the competency question, which comes back to the delivery questions, and is the machinery of government fit for purpose to drive the agenda government wants to see, that I think is the core of whether we rebuild trust.
Really interesting. Thank you, Charlotte. William, what do you think of some of those points? I'm also going to throw in an extra question as well, because I think it will give us a good sort of throwing forward finish, which is whether you think the government's increased risk appetite following EU exit and COVID emergency response will change the nature of domestic policymaking in the future. I'm starting questioning whether there is an increased risk appetite, and almost the huge state interventions has shown the power of government and has led to a reduced risk appetite around some of these things. But anyway, that's a separate question. But William, thoughts on that, and on kind of accountability?
I think in respect of that question, I'd agree with you. I think there's less of an appetite for risk. But my reflection for Charlotte was so there, and one of the things we've not mentioned in this all, particularly ministers, and about one blames tools, do they not? And too often I'm struck by the civil service being unfairly, if I can say so, unfairly aligned, whereas the actual issue has been the competence of ministers. And I entirely agree with what Charlotte said about the need for ministers not to delegate or defer decision making, and to hide behind that because it's politically convenient so do. And I think those are the much more difficult question for politicians. And just as there's training capacity, and there's a substantial training capacity within the service, so there is beginning to be for ministers. But I would say as a confirmed backbencher who merely just has to snipe from time to time. But I think it's one of those issues that that ministers need to face, and we shouldn't shy away from.
Brilliant. Thank you, William. And I refer you and everybody to our ministers chapter in Whitehall Monitor. He says doing the IFG branding point again. I think we'll. It's a minute to 1 o'clock. I want to finish on time, so I think we'll leave it there. Thank you to a fantastic panel. Really interesting discussion. Thanks also to all the colleagues across the IFG who drew together the Whitehall Monitor this year, and particularly to everybody who's watched online and those who've submitted questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get around to answering all of them, but there were lots of really interesting ones in there. We will put up a video and audio recordings of this event in the usual places on our website and our podcast streams. Go to the website for upcoming events. We touched on accountability there. We've got an event next week, Thursday afternoon, talking about the accountability of the civil service and ministers, and whether we should put the civil service on a more statutory basis. So I'm looking forward to that one, and lots of other events coming up at the Institute for Government. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your week.